Hi there, I'm Woolly Wormhead. I am a knit designer that specialises in hats, technique and construction. If you've met any of my patterns before, you might have realised that I have a bit of a thing for unusually constructed hats. I like to try out different construction methods and see what the stitches do and how I can use technique to bring things together. One thing that I'm well known for is sideways knit hats. Now, this is an example of a sideways knit hat that I have on my needles here. It's ready to be grafted. It's a little bit different compared to other ones that I have done because it's got some bias knitting on it, as though it's got some shape going on there. That doesn't make any difference at all to the graft. But I thought, while I've got this and I'm almost ready to graft it and block it, ready for a photo shoot that we hope to do in the next couple of weeks, I'm aiming to release this in autumn 2025-ish. But while it's at this point, I would film how I finish off a sideways knit hat. Because some people find that finishing the sideways knit hats is a little bit intimidating. It's not difficult, it's just maybe new to some people. All right, it's nothing that you can't do. Anybody can do this. There's a couple of golden rules that you need to remember though when you're working sideways, especially if you want to maintain a continuous pattern, and especially if you're working in garter stitch, because that's the base that I'm working with today. So the first thing is to remember that garter stitch is a 2-row stitch pattern. That means that you always have to have an even number of knit rows for the garter stitch to be continuous. People often think that garter stitch is just all knit stitches, and it is, but it's not a single row stitch pattern, it's a 2-row stitch pattern. I go into this in great depth in other workshops. So that means that we need to bring an odd number of rows together to graft, because a graft replaces an entire row of knitting. The graft itself has a relationship with the 2 rows either side. So if you hear people say, oh, grafting replaces 2 rows, what they mean is they replace it, it mimics 2 pattern rows, okay, because it has a relationship with the row below it and the one that's kind of like underneath the provisional cast on. But it is only literally one physical row. It's impossible for it to be 2 physical rows, if that makes sense. I think I'm going to do another tutorial specifically about garter stitch grafting and demonstrating this to help kind of like explain this. But just remember that there's always got to be an odd number of rows brought together to do a garter stitch graft, because it needs an even number of rows to keep garter stitch continuous. So in my patterns, you'll read the instructions to do a provisional cast on, then you go straight into the first panel. Don't work a plain row after the provisional cast on unless the pattern tells you to do that. If you do it, you're going to mess up the graft. All right. In some stitches, it might not matter, but in my patterns, it does. So don't put a plain row after the provisional cast on, just go straight into the first panel. Then when you get to the end, having worked however many patterns the pattern tells you to do, however many panels the pattern tells you to do, in my instructions will say on the final pattern, omit the last row, because that gets replaced by the graft. And that is what we're going to do here. That means that the graft is one plain row of knit stitches, and it closes off the last panel and joins it to the first panel. So those are the key things to keep in mind. As I say, I'll explain more about garter stitch grafting. That's a whole topic in itself in another tutorial. All right, but I wanted to just make that clear here. So this sideways knit hat did the provisional cast on, went straight into the first panel, worked consecutive panels all the way around, and on the last panel, I haven't worked the last row of the panel because it's going to be replaced by the graft. So I'm going to switch the overhead now so you can have a little bit closely at this, and then we will take out the provisional cast on, we will start to do the grafting, and then I'll show you how I finish the crown all in one go. All right. Okay then, so here we have this hat. We can see the panels that have all been worked. It's an unusual shape at the beginning because it has some bias knitting as well as some short rows to create stripes on this side of the work. So don't let this put you off, this shaping here. It's not going to make any difference at all to the grafting. The grafting is still the same. In fact, when it kind of like finished grafting, it will slot together like jigsaw pieces. You can't really see the same shape happening over here because it's on the needles, but it will do when it comes together. So what we're going to do first of all is we are going to remove the provisional cast on, and we always remove the provisional cast on from the end that we started at, and that's this end here. Okay, now to remove the provisional cast on, we're going to have a needle of the same size or smaller. So I've got another needle here that's just either the same size or one size smaller than the one that I'm going to be that I'd worked the hat in. The reason why you might want to go one size smaller is that if you're provisionally cast on stitches have been sitting on the waste yarn a little while, they might have shrunk around the waste yarn, and a slightly smaller needle makes it easier to remove the stitches. So we've got a little knot there. Let's get that knot out there. And then this is the waste yarn. Okay, so I'd cast on extra stitches. Whenever I teach this, I always say to people, cast on extra stitches than you need, because then you've got a length of chain that is a useful indicator for which end is the where you started and which end you're working away from or which end you're working towards. Yarn tail is a very useful indicator for things like that. And it also means that the opening yarn that we started with can be tied with it so that anchors it and doesn't come undone. So the first few chains we can just unravel. Now, it's really, really tempting to unzip the entire provisional cast on, but we don't actually really want to do that because it means we have a risk of dropping the stitches from the underside, and you don't want that. All right, when you have drop stitches from the top side of the work, that's trouble enough. You don't want it from the underside. So I always tell people to put the needle in first. Okay, at this point here, put it into the stitch, so that you've caught the stitch before you undo it. Doesn't matter. Don't worry about stitch orientation at this point, because you can reorientate them before you graft them. What's most important is you release all of the stitches safely, and then you can do the reorientation afterwards. So we've put our needle in that one. We undo it. And we keep going like this all the way through until you have all of the stitches released. You can see that the wool is a little bit hairy around the provisional cast on. That's because it's been on there a few weeks, which is why having cotton as the waste yarn is my recommendation. It's my tip. It's what I teach, because cotton won't felt into any other fibers. And I use wool nearly all of the time. So I want to make sure I have a yarn that's going to be easy to release. So I'm going to carry on now, release all of these stitches, and then when I get to the end, I'm going to show you how I treat the end and then how we reorientate them. Okay? Okay, so I've now got to the end of unpicking my stitches, and I want to just talk about what's going on at the end here. Hopefully you can see that nice and clearly on that stitch. So we're going to undo this one, because that is a stitch, pull it through. Now, what we've got here, let's just remove that. You can see that the yarn is still anchored here at this point. Now, that technically isn't a stitch, because grafting is, it creates like a half stitch jog. Those two extra kind of like half stitches that make up the continuous row, but without getting too technical, what they are is they are actually the loops that go from the end of one row to you start the next one. It actually kind of forms part of the selvage down here. So it's like when you turn your work and start knitting again, you've made a little loop when you go on to the next stitch. And that's what that's attached to there. Now, when you release your stitches from provisional cast on, you will have one stitch less. Depending on the project that you're working on, you may well have to try and find somewhere to make up that stitch. Maybe you don't need to. It depends. For my sideways knit hats, I say do not use this loop here as a stitch, because it will create a jog, a visible jog when you do your grafting. Leave that as the end loop stitch, and when we need to make up the extra stitch, we'll take it from the crown end, because once you've done your graft, you're going to have a small circle at the crown up here, and we need to close that circle once we finish grafting, and using one of the stitches from there, or using one of the edges from there, will actually help us. So it makes up the stitches, the one stitch deficit in the graft, and helps close the crown. So I'm now going to pull that through there. Now, if we turn our work, we can see that our stitches are not clearly orientated. They're lying in the wrong way. As I said at the beginning, it doesn't matter when you're taking your graft out if they're the wrong way around. However, you will need to reorientate them if they're not the right way around before you start grafting. So I'm using a long circular here. So I'm just going to go through the whole row and reorientate them like this, so that they sit the right way around, because otherwise, if we don't do that, we've either going to end up with twisted stitches in our graft, or we've got to remember to untwist them when we graft, which is just, you don't want to do any extra work in your graft if you don't need to. So move all of those around, and then when I've done that, we'll be back at the other end, and then we'll be ready to start our grafting. Okay, I'm now coming towards the end of having reorientated all of my stitches. Do the last one there, and we can see that they're now all looking the correct way around. I've got a few cat hairs in there. It's the way of the world. So that's where we started on. We'll leave that to that side. So the stitches are now correctly orientated. So we now have to go back. So that's how they look there on the crown. This will be the crown edge, and they're all looking nice and neat all the way down. So let's turn that around and pull the circular through. Okay. So one thing that's really important about, or one way, should I say, of making sure that you've got your stitches set up correctly for grafting, because you remember before I said that garter stitch is a 2-row stitch pattern. You need to make sure that there is an odd number of rows brought together to make sure that your grafting is even. There are ways that you can check to make sure that your stitches are set up correctly. The easiest way is to hold your stitches parallel. And this is a terminology I started using in my first book, which was called Going Straight, which was all sideways knit hats. I wanted to develop a terminology for grafting garter stitch that did away with right side, wrong side of garter stitch, because that gets confusing when it's all knit rows. So I started using the terminology, and this was back in 2007, ridge high and ridge low. And it basically just describes what's happening with garter stitch, because garter stitch is ridges that sit high on the needle one side here, and on the opposite side you've got valleys, they sit low. Okay, so that's ridge low and this is ridge high, because garter stitch is alternate ridges and valleys. So if you bring your two needles together and they are both ridge high when they're held parallel like this, then they are ready to graft, because you've got an odd number of stitches together. The other way of checking, if you prefer, is to lay them flat. You'll have ridges high there, and it's ridge low here because you've got your V's next to the needle. Okay, but the easiest way to do it is to hold them together and to be parallel. Now, the amount of yarn that you need for the graft is normally 3 times the length of the row. So that's 1, 2, 3. Let's get me some scissors and cut that yarn there. Okay, so I am now going to start the garter stitch graft. Now, the yarn is on the front side here. So what I'm actually going to do, instead of doing a reverse garter stitch graft, I'm just going to turn my work inside out and do it this way around, because I can, and because that's one of the easy things about grafting, is you can graft inside out. It's going to make your knitting easier, because it's always better to start with the yarn anchored to the back of your work here. All right, let's get those needles in frame there. That's it. Because you're going to work on the front needle first, and then you're going to work on the back needle. So if I'd have done it the other way around, I've had to thread my yarn through to the back, and if I just turn my work inside out, it's already there. And the graft is exactly the same, because we've both still got ridge high on both sides. Now, the nice thing about grafting garter stitch is that once we've got our setup correct, i.e. an odd number of rows brought together and our prep is correct, the graft itself is actually much easier than stocking stitch. Stocking stitch is like the red herring of grafting world, which is something, if you've ever attended in my classes, you'll hear me say but quite often, because it is. And that again is a whole other video in and of itself. But for now, suffice to say that this is actually a much more straightforward graft than stocking stitch. You will need to work the selvages first, so we've got to close those stitches off. And then we're going to work the stitches across, and then when we get to the end, the crown end, we will do the closing off that end. But the reason why grafting garter stitch is easier than any other stitch, certainly easier than the stocking stitch, is that what you do on the front needle, you do on the back needle. All right. So you don't have to kind of like remember a mantra that's kind of the opposites. You actually do the same both ways. And it means if you stop partway through the graft, it's a lot easier to remember, pick up where you were, because you haven't got to try and remember whether you've just done a purl on or a purl off or whatever. It's the same on both needles. So the grafting mantra for ridge pie garter stitch is knit off, purl on, knit off, purl on. So to work our selvages, we are going to, because we don't want to, we're opening up the graft here, so we don't want to take these stitches off straight away. So we do purl on the front, purl on the back. All right, and now that means that we've worked the selvage and we're ready to continue with the rest of the graft. So we go knit, insert our needle knitwise, slip it off, and then purlwise into the next one and keep it on. Whoop. Knit off, let's see that there, and purl on. And the yarn will catch around the needle, so watch out for that, because it will make it look like it's extra stitches, especially when you're just starting off a fresh graft and you've got all that yarn on there on your needle. Knit off, purl on. And this one seems to be particularly springy today. Knit off, purl on. Now you might notice that either way that my fingers are keeping quite tight control of the knitting close to where the stitches are on the needle tips. That's deliberate to make sure things don't fall off. I've had enough accidents in grafting where stitches are all kind of like unraveled, and we don't want to do that. So I keep quite tight control on what they are doing to stop them disappearing. So knit off, purl on, knit off, purl on. Let's see if I can get this up closer to the camera for the next one. So knit off, purl on, knit off, purl on. I'm going to stop there because what I want to do, we can see where we started to graft. This is actually the graft line here. So what we want to do is we want to start to tighten it up a little bit so that we don't have any uneven tension. If you leave the tidying up of the graft until the very end, it's going to be much harder for you to get your stitches nice and even. Do it every 5 to 10 stitches, and then it will make a much, much neater graft. Okay, and then we carry on like this. Let's stitches up, knit off, purl on, knit off, purl on, whoop. Knit off, purl on, springy yarn is getting in the way there. Knit off, purl on. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fast forward this because you don't need to see and watch the whole of this graft. And then when I get towards the end of the graft, I will then show you how we finish off the graft, and then we go into finishing off the crown. Okay, so we have now, or I've now got to the end of my graft. I was grafting along this line here, and it went around there and around there, and the idea is that it is meant to be invisible. That's the point of grafting, is to have a continuous piece of knitting with no visible seam. We are now at the point where we are going to be finishing off with the last few stitches. Now these last few can start to misbehave because they can slip a little bit off the needles, so we want to avoid that happening. These ones on the front needle, these are the ones that release from the provisional cast on in particular, can misbehave, especially if you're on a smaller needle, because they start to loosen up by the time they get to here. Now, I also have on the back needle some German short rows. Now, if you remember, I turn my work inside out. So What was originally the front needle was the last panel. The short rows at the crown hadn't been worked across because the last row is going to be replaced by the graft. And then we turn the work inside out to make the grafting easier. So they are now on the back needle. Now, while I'm here, I will show you how to graft a German short row because they're really easy. But what I want to do is I want to show you that there are 2, 4, 5 double leg stitch across the back. Let's see if I can put that against the plain background so it's easier for you to see. Lift it up a little bit. 2, 4, 5. And we've only got 4 stitches on the front needle. That's because the stitches that are on the front needle are those that were released from the provisional cast on, and they will have 1 stitch less. Remember how we talked about not picking up the side loop at the end because we don't want to create a jog down at the beginning of our graft down here. There is no jog. It's all completely, let's put that, there's no jog in there. That's all nice and perfectly even. So to be able to make up that extra stitch, what we do is we take it from the crown because we have to close the crown. Like when you work a vertically knit hat, you have a little hole when you've got the, I don't know, you've decreased down to 8 stitches and you have to break your yarn and thread through and do what I call a drawstring bind off to close the hole. You get a similar thing with a sideways knit hat. There's going to be a little hole at the top that you need to close off. So taking 1 stitch from the crown end is actually going to be kind of like just like one of the selvage slip stitches here. Take a loop from that one there. It not only evens up the number of stitches that you need, but it also helps close the crown. So let me take that off again. This is the number of stitches that we have. And what I have done is see those line of ridges there? I am picking up 1 loop from the edge ridge of the selvage because you have these at the crown on a sideways knit hat because each panel has an opening and closing row. Okay, so that creates a ridge at the crown. And then we use them to close the hat off. But for the time being, we're going to use that one to even up the number of stitches so that we can finish off our graft. And let's try and tuck that yarn tail in so it's out of the way because we want to be very careful with what these stitches are going to do and what's the end of that needle is misbehaving slightly. Let's pull that through so it's out of the way of our graft. Because as I say, the last few stitches, they get a little bit slippery and we don't want anything to get in the way of us finishing this off. Actually, now that I've taken it through there, that should be okay. Right. So, knit off, purl on. And on the back needle, we have a double leg stitch. And when you knit across a German short row, you put your needle tip up between the 2 and you knit it to knit them across. Okay. You do exactly the same with your tapestry needle when you're grafting it. You treat it exactly the same way. So we just knit off and purl on. All right. So we're going through the middle of the double leg stitch, just like you do when you knit across it. Okay. Knit off, purl on. And I'll same on the back. Make sure you get through both of the double leg stitch, knit off, purl on, knit off, purl on, knit off, purl on. Now, as you get towards the end and you're going to be tempted to sort of tighten these up, don't do it until you've worked this last stitch because I can't tell you the amount of times I have dropped that last stitch because I've gone to tighten this up and you've only got 1 or 2 stitches on the needle and the needle slips out and before you know it, you've lost your stitches. So wait to tidy up these last few until you've done the finishing of the graft for the crown. Knit off, purl on, knit off, purl on. And because we now need to close off the selvage, we just knit off and knit off on both sides. Pull that through. Let's get rid of those needles. Now, and there's our little hole. Let's just tidy up these last few stitches. Tidy up the slack from the graft. If you didn't quite catch how to graft across the German short row, don't worry, I'm working on another tutorial for that, and it's something I cover a lot. Funny enough, with sideways knit hats and short row colour work, I do a lot of the stuff with German short rows. Surprise, surprise. So I've just tidied up the graft. That's nice and neat there. And to finish off, to do like what I call a sideways draw screw bind off, you actually just go through all of the ridges around you. So as if these were stitches on a vertically knit hat, and you put your yarn through the last remaining stitches, you're going to put them through all of these selvage stitches, or selvage ridges. It's probably a better way to describe them. Little knobbly bits at the end that you get of garter stitch, right? And you just go through each one on the end. I do have a photo tutorial for this on my blog, in case this isn't quite clear enough. And then we're going to come back through this last one that we worked through before, that we treated as part of the graft. Slip it in there. Whoop. And then we pull that nice and tightly closed, and that does exactly the same thing. So that yarn tail we got out of the way, that belongs on the inside of the work, but this is now the right side of the work, and you can see how they've all been pulled together like that, and that closes up the hole. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to fasten off these stitches, weaving on my ends, but what I'll quickly do is I'll push that back through to the other side of the work where it belongs. We only got it out of the way, so it wasn't in the way when we were grafting, but it does actually belong on the wrong side. And besides all the ends not being woven in, there is our finished grafted sideways knit hat. There's the hole, which once I've tightened up the yarn will just disappear completely. And let's see if we can find the graft. There is the graft line here. Okay. Oh, I'm in focus. And you can't see it at all because it's done properly in garter stitch. And there is the hat. I'm now going to weave in all the ends and block it and get it ready for the next photo shoot. But I hope that helps in seeing how to finish off a sideways knit hat, how to remove the provisional cast on, how to graft the edges together, how to graft across short rows, and how to finish off that crown at the top. And that's, as I say, what I call a sideways draw through bind off. There are tutorials for all of these, photo tutorials for all of these things on my blog, except not the whole process if you want to go and have a look at photos instead. But I hope this helps. All right. Okay. Please do the YouTube thing and like, subscribe, etc. And if sideways hats have caught your attention, then do go and have a look at my website, because I have a lot of sideways knit hats there. All right, I have a number of patterns that will work this way, and in the shop there is a search filter for sideways construction, so you can have a look at all the different hats that I have designed that way and the patterns that are available to you. In fact, this whole book is about it. All right, so thanks for joining me today. Happy hatting.